Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen in the room, and good evening to everyone watching over the world as well. When we're doing the sound check, one of the members of the people organising the night at home and in lockdown, and they couldn't hear. But then one of Jane's friends in the UK could hear, so it's all about turning the microphone off mute, as we know in this era. So yeah, welcome to A Sensible Approach to Climate. What does our community think? My name's Ross Cargill and I'm your MC for the evening. I'm here because I got asked, but I got asked by three leaders who I really respect in the community. Rachel rang me about less than a fortnight ago to ask if I'd do the honour of MC in the evening, and she mentioned Jane and Leslie on board, and it was a yes, a categorical yes straight away. So thank you very much for having me. I think one of the takeaways I'd like to see from the evening is that not all leaders wear badges. And it's really important as a community that on important issues like this, that it doesn't matter what our position is, what our worldview is that we walk away and we try and not influence, but lead the people around us to make better decisions. And I think particularly on an issue such as climate, it's really important that we do that. So I'm not an expert this evening. I'm not going to bore you with my anecdotes about leadership nor the environment. My training's in agriculture, albeit now I own Men and Women at Work, obviously a traffic management and labour hire company, and also Learning Live, which is an RTO that trains over 2,500 students a year. Anyhow, enough about me. I am looking forward to the evening and looking forward to emceeing a very energetic evening. It's a facilitated discussion exploring common ground and areas of disagreement of climate change in the local context. I'd like to introduce you to Jane Evans, who will be facilitating the evening. Jane has worked in the public health sector for over 35 years in senior leadership roles, most recently as General Manager of Port Macquarie Base Hospital and across the Hastings Macleay. Jane is currently an adjunct senior lecturer and senior researcher in community health and preventative health at Charles Sturt University. We've invited questions for the panel this evening from the community via the ticketing app and when you registered. Thank you for your questions. They've been collated and we've already provided those to the panel. We do know that climate can be a divisive or is a divisive topic for the community. We hope that this will provide an opportunity to have a respectful and positive discussion about climate issues, including the recent proposal to revoke the Port Macquarie Hastings Council climate policy. But before we get underway, there is some housekeeping matters. So, number one, if you need to do number ones and number twos, out the back, to the right, then to the left, there's three toilets, one for boys, one for girls, and one for disabled people. So that's where that is. If there's an emergency, and we're all used to emergencies after 3 years of fires, floods and COVIDs, we go out, find the nearest exit, the little green people that are running out, but we're going that way, across the car park and onto the front oval. So we obviously have a list of everyone who's here, so please do that in an orderly fashion. Hopefully nothing untoward happens. The only thing we've probably got left is maybe a locust plague. Anyhow. Also, telephones. Don't ask me how to do Android, I don't know. Aeroplane mode, silent, off, in your pocket. Just, we don't need to hear anyone's crazy frog ringtone from back in the day. Similarly, we do have we're recording the evening that's being streamed, and we do have a photographer, but if you could just ask that no one else takes any photographs or videos, that'd be greatly appreciated. And a final reminder is that we won't be asking for any questions from the floor tonight. So, yeah, we have a very knowledgeable panel and they have been provided with the questions that have been provided previously. So I'm sure, and we all do want to get home this evening, that we'll fill those 2 hours in very quickly. Okay, without further ado, I'd like to welcome and introduce each of tonight's panellists to the stage. Firstly, we have Gordon Birch, former SCAS chairman, scientist, numerous community organisation and community roles. So, thank you, Gordon. Yep, over there. Then we have Teresa Cochrane, proud Dunghutti Gumbunya woman studying environmental science and management at CSU. Angela Frimberger, PM Chamber of Commerce, Deputy Chair for Veterinarians for Climate Change. Peter Johnson, board member of Eco Tourism Australia and owner of Diamond Waters Eco Resort in the Camden Haven. Georgia Ritchie, medical oncologist at the Mid North Coast Local Health District Cancer Institute. Brian Tierney, long-time local developer and active PMH community and committee member. And finally, but not leastly, Leslie Williams, State Member of Parliament for Port Macquarie. I think you'd all agree we have a very diverse panel in front of us for this evening's discussions. So it is with great pleasure, first of all, that I invite Auntie Rodner to the stage. Auntie Rodner Radley, who will provide an acknowledgement of country.
Naga Baragai, Yi Barai Marungang. Boga Briang Guruwagu, Yi Birapai Barai. And could you just shut your eyes gently while I translate? See with me, this land is beautiful, from the mountains to the sea. This is Birapai land. Open your eyes now. Because sometimes, you know, when I talk about the beautiful mountains to the sea, and I know that you've seen this here in Birapai country, it's just, you can't see it here, but we've all got that vision in our mind, and it's pretty awesome, isn't it? Yeah. Nata Birapai gu barai gu, gumu marungal, Nata ban ronda, Anjukuri. I'm a custodian of Birapai land. I am Auntie Rhonda and Anjukuri Rhonda Radley, and I suppose I've called lots of other things. Nan, Mum, you know, you get that. Yeah. Wanimbu ganila, wanimbu gani, Birapai barai. Always was and always will be Birapai land. Mara gaga, tumu marung wakuda. Come, be a care of this land as one. Be a voice for the voiceless. I acknowledge the land to honour and respect landforms, waterways, creatures, plants, stars, Dangaigang, the ancestors, all that land holds. You here today. Gatai Nirung Wakuda. Let us all go as one. Marumbu. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Auntie Rhonda. I always find that the Welcome to Country is such a movie experience. So thank you very much for having us all and allowing us to be custodians of the land as well that we stand on. Regrettably, we do have some apologies this evening. Now, community members may be aware that Port Macquarie Hastings Council has recently rescinded its previous climate emergency declaration. However, fewer people that know that Council resolved to place on public exhibition a proposal to rescind revoke Council's general climate policy. Councillors Edwards, Interman, Lipovac and Shepherd believe that retaining a climate policy is something that most people in our community agree on. As a result, they have promoted a panel to be organised, and an event has been taken up by the fabulous team of volunteers here, including the panel members, to enable us important community discussion. But please note, this is not a council event. Unfortunately, in a twist of bad luck, an extraordinary meeting of Port Macquarie Hastings Council has been called this evening to deliberate. You can tell Jane wrote some of this because there's no way I would use deliberate. It's just, I was going to trip on it. Like I would have just tripped up the stairs. Anyhow, There's been some urgent attention required at councils. As such, councillors Edwards, Intiman, Lipovac and Shepherd give their apologies that they can't be here tonight. They offer great thanks to everyone for coming and being part of the attendance, both online and here, and look forward to future collaboration and constructive working together as a community. So, without further delay, I'd like you to I ask you to welcome Jane to the stage, and we'll get on with this evening's proceedings. Thank you very much.
I'm going to hold the microphone. I think it's easier for all of us. So first of all, thank you, Ross, and thank you very much, Auntie Rhonda, for the welcome, which was, as always, amazing. I also acknowledge and pay respects to the traditional owners of the land that we meet on tonight. So before we get into the panel discussion, I'd briefly like to set the scene for you all. The organisers of the event had a vision and a purpose. They were looking for a robust panel discussion about climate change between an amazing, diverse body of well-respected Port Macquarie Hastings locals. And the main aim for tonight is for Port Macquarie Hastings residents that might at this moment in time be somewhat overwhelmed by the science and less likely to get into conversation on the subject, to walk away more willing and able to discuss climate concerns and solutions. And we're hoping that that will be in a respectful and positive way with one another into the future. There were also some very specific objectives that the organisers of the event set out. The first is to grow community awareness, and this might be the first of a number of meetings similar to this on this topic, but also on other topics. And the community awareness for tonight that we're focusing on is the proposed rescission of the Port Macquarie Hastings Council Climate Change Response Policy. But just as importantly, and perhaps even more importantly, is to normalise the now broadly accepted mainstream understanding for the need for sensible action on climate change. We also really want to try and identify areas of common ground that we can agree upon, and we want to acknowledge where there are areas of difference. Now, the most frequently asked question that was submitted by you, the community, on our website was why? Why would council propose to revoke the climate policy? And that's a question that's going to probably hang for a little. And the reason why is we don't represent council. We can't speak for council or explain the reasoning behind the proposed rescission. However, tonight you will hear the panel respond to your questions on this matter. And I would encourage audience members and those listening live to provide feedback to the council through the Have Your Say link on the council's website. And you as community members and residents have until the 6th of May to provide your responses. So let's move on to the main event of the evening, which is, first of all, to start the panel discussion. I'd like in turn to ask each of you to introduce yourselves and explain why you believe it's important to be here tonight. So thank you. I'm going to start with Leslie.
Well, thank you very much, Jane. Hopefully I don't need too much of an introduction after being your local member for nearly 11.5 years. But anyway, it's absolutely fantastic to be here, and I just want to start by acknowledging the organisers and really thank them for this opportunity. And what really attracted me to come along and be a part of the event was that the heading of the event was a sensible approach. Because actually I think after listening to the community for so many years, that is actually what they're looking for. I believe that our community actually is done with the debate about whether or not there is climate change. I think we have actually moved on. I think we are, as a community, over the discussion. And I think that what our community is really looking for from us as leaders and from council is leadership. I think genuinely we have a community that is practical. And I guess that's why I feel like I have such an affiliation with them, because many people who know me know that I am into actually getting on and doing things. I sometimes get a little bit impatient. I understand there has to be policies and business plans and consultation. I think we all accept that. But there is a point in time when what we want to see is action. So whilst I am a politician, ironically, what I don't want to hear about is the political. I want to hear about the practical. And I actually think that is what our community expects. They expect us to guide them, to lead them. But I think when it comes to climate change, I think importantly, what they want to do is be given opportunities. And that is really what they are seeking from the leaders from our community. So as I said, I welcome the opportunity to hear from the community, to have this discussion tonight. And I really hope that is just one of many that we will have in the future. And lastly, I just want to make the comment that, yeah, I'm a little bit bewildered and probably perplexed by most people in the room about why you would want to rescind a climate change response policy that actually was only ratified by Council in October last year. So I'm sure there will be more to say about that as we go along, but thanks so much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Leslie, and welcome. And over to Brian.
Thank you, Jane. Why I believe it's important to be here tonight. When I became aware that out of the blue, Council had resolved to revoke the climate change response policy, and of course they were required to have their 28-day time on exhibition on Have Your Say, I immediately fired off a response to Have Your Say. And I think if I go through my response, which Gordon takes 3 minutes and 15 seconds, that will give you an indication of how I see it's important that I'm here tonight. The submission I put to Council is I'm firmly against the proposal to rescind the climate change response policy. In fact, it just doesn't make sense to me that anyone, let alone elected councillors who have a clear responsibility and duty of care to the public, could even consider promoting or supporting such a proposal. The current climate change policy was adopted by the previous council in October 2021, and the council did follow due, proper process, and there was broad community support for for the adoption of that proposal. Now we come to our new council. I know Leslie doesn't want to get involved in politics, but I think politics they're looming all around this, and I'm going to talk about politics. In fact, this is what's into the council at the moment. It was apparent, or I thought, that the single statement or declaration that was causing people problems was what they called the climate change, the climate emergency declaration. And indeed, that declaration in the policy said that Council has recognised and declared that we are now in a state of global climate emergency. One-handed. But at its subsequent March meeting, by that same narrow majority, Council has actually resolved to go much further and rescind the entire policy, leaving behind nothing in its place. For over 60 years of my professional practice, I've watched our community, which is so very special to all of us, grow. Our population has grown tenfold during my time, at least. We all value highly the diverse geographical systems ranging from our coastal headlands, our beaches, our major rivers and estuaries, the floodplains, the mountains, the forests, the national parks. Each of these systems faces its own grave threats as the population of our LGA continues to grow. Threats from increased coastal erosion, loss of beaches, raging floods, wildfires, all directly related to climate change, and all with the potential to cause great loss of property, great loss of life, and great loss of biodiversity. How could anyone even consider moving forward without a well thought through and a community supported response policy? which is where we find ourselves if council revokes the current policy and leaves nothing in its place. I exhort councillors, go back, rethink, start again. Please don't leave our community, our people, our children, their children, and the generations that follow to face the inevitable climate change without a broadly accepted response policy. For goodness sake, having a climate policy is just good common sense. It's just the right thing to do. And as the largest business operating in the Hastings, it's incumbent on council to be a leader and show leadership to all of the thousands of businesses that make up our local economy. Now, I've studied the draft climate change response policy, which had that terrible clause of an emergency declaration in it. That's been stripped out, and there's been an amended policy which was put to council. When it was put to council by 5-4, they said, no, that's not what we meant. We meant rescind the whole darn thing. So what I've said to the council is I've studied the draft policy which was presented to the meeting on the 17th of March. This is essentially the current standing policy with the reference to the global climate emergency statement, which some councillors obviously are objecting to, that statement removed. And I commend this amended policy to council for its approval. So that's gone into the ether and it's on the Have My Say column.
Brian, thank you very much. I think we can all appreciate your position, and I certainly won't dock that 15 seconds of run over. Moving on to Georgia.
So hi everyone. So I'm Dr. Georgia Ritchie and I'm a local cancer specialist at the Mid North Coast Cancer Institute. I'm also a mother of 2 young boys. So I've been coming up to Port Macquarie for over 10 years through my medical training. I had to do my specialist training and finish it down in Sydney, but I first came up here as a baby intern, a very junior doctor. And I moved up here permanently, moved my family up here 4 years ago. And I've always loved our local community. I came and wanted to move from the city up here because of the beautiful natural environment we have, because of the amazing people I've met. And I noted all the staff in the hospital seemed to be happy compared to all the city folk. And the other thing I thought was really important was to be able to contribute to a regional community. So why am I here? So I guess as a scientist and doctor, I've always believed in what climate scientists have said. And I've always thought it's common sense. We blow smoke into the atmosphere, we consume waste. How can we not be having some impact on the earth? But it really came to a head for me, and I became really alarmed after we had that terrible drought followed by the bushfires. At the time, I had a 10-month-old baby. I was worried about the smoke he was breathing in every day. And as a result, I started reading on this subject in detail, and I wasn't reading just the IPCC report. And if you haven't read that, I implore you to do so. It's pretty confronting. But I read about climate change and health, and I was pretty alarmed to see that climate change is a really big problem for health, and it's actually a health emergency. And I'm not standing alone in understanding this. This is a big part of healthcare, and this is a big movement in healthcare, that climate change is a health emergency. So the Australian Medical Association has declared climate change a health emergency, the Royal College of Physicians, surgeons, general practitioners, anaesthetists, emergency physicians, and the list goes on. And that's not to talk about all the worldwide health organisations that have declared it as a health emergency. I also have here a letter which I can let you circulate later, which has got over 130 local doctors and healthcare workers that are signed on declaring that they believe that climate change is a health emergency. So the good news is that if we all agree with that, that some of the responses to climate change in health are actually good for our health. So if we start to act, we can actually potentially enjoy better healthcare. Finally, I guess I want to also make the point to what Brian talked about. I don't think it should be a divisive political issue, climate change. It should be a bipartisan issue. We all work together as a community to face this massive issue that we've got. And we have clear evidence we're capable of doing that. We've just gone through a global pandemic, of COVID response. As a community, we stood together. And I think if we stand together as a community and work together on this issue, we can have huge wins and potentially benefit the health of our generation and future generations to come. But obviously, if we don't do anything, then potentially the consequences are quite dire.
Thank you very much, Georgia. And moving on to Peter.
Leslie stole my word. I was going to start off with, I'm a little bit bewildered. And so I'll pass on that. But my name's Peter Johnson, and I'm a former healthcare manager. But later in life, I've taken on the passion of running a tourism business. It's an eco-tourism business. And I have a passion for the environment. And that's led me to also join the board of Ecotourism Australia. Now, in my career, and I've often found that when you've had a monumental stuff up, it's generally because there's been a lack of direction, a lack of policy, clear guidelines on how to do things consistently and appropriately. And that's what my greatest concern would be about the council's decision at the moment. I also note that council is stepping away from all of the other councils on the North Coast. Almost all of them have got fairly detailed policies. Some organisations, some local government councils are even moving towards having higher levels of requirements, such as rights of nature policies. So we are running the risk of stepping outside the mainstream. This is no longer pioneering stuff, which I think some of the former speakers have already mentioned. So we run the risk of falling behind in respect to the response to what is, I believe, a climate emergency. I recently went to an eco-destination think tank where over a couple of hundred people from around Australia turned up to talk about the new eco-destination certification program, which has started off as a result of the bushfires and funding from the World Wildlife Foundation to inspire local government areas and destinations to think more closely about how tourism has traded on the environment, and it is our turn to give back. And so, and that has become very much my passion. It's the passion of my wife. It's become the passion of my children. So we really firmly believe that our industry has a role to play in giving back to the environment. And probably that's true for most industries and representatives around the meeting here tonight. But it's also about optimism and good business. There are so many exciting things that can be achieved if we have good policy, good direction, a clear collegiate approach from the community. Some of you here tonight may have had the opportunity to see John Dee from Planet Ark, who was brought to the area by the local tourism association, and talk about all the inspiring things we can do that would help mitigate the risk and contribute to a climate response. So many of those things are on the optimistic side, and so many things of those would make our lives better. So I see that great opportunity as opposed to just talking about the doom and gloom. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Peter, I'm sure we're going to come on to talk about those mitigation ideas that you have. I think that's important for tonight. So, Angela.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming tonight. We face many important challenges in today's complex world. I personally put the bulk of my efforts into climate change because it affects every other issue. Climate change touches on everything we care about. We all love our families, and if we have children or grandchildren, we try to ensure that their futures will be bright. We care about our communities. We want our friends and neighbors to be safe and healthy, our towns to thrive. We want our businesses to be successful in a healthy economy. As citizens and human beings, we care about immigration and defense, and we recognize moral and humanitarian problems. And as a veterinarian, I especially worry about loss of biodiversity, climate change as a health problem, and particularly about the impact on animals. Although I was worried about the environment for years, and I felt that as an educated person in a wealthy country, I ought to be doing something somehow to make things better. I just didn't know what or how. So some years ago, I attended a training by the Australian Conservation Foundation that focused on the science behind why climate change is occurring, what's happening now, and what can potentially be expected under different possible conditions. And importantly, what can be done to improve the situation and how to share this information with others. Since then, I've spent a lot of volunteer time on this. Locally, I became involved with the Energy Forever, Port Macquarie Hastings Community Renewable Energy Project and Sustainability Grants Program. Been with Energy Forever since 2015. And in 2019, I helped to co-found Veterinarians for Climate Action. And I've also done a lot of talking and writing in this time. But staying with the theme of taking the politics out of it, climate change is not an inherently political problem. It's a science problem. And so I do echo that theme of we're all in this together. Let's take the politics out of it and just do what we need to do. The bottom line is, as a vet, I'm passionate about animals, and I know that most Australians are too. And we vets see that all kinds of animals and their people are harmed by the effects of a changing climate. There is no place, home, or habitat anywhere in the world where animals are not vulnerable to the effects of climate change. 30 years ago, I took an oath to use my scientific knowledge and skills for the protection of animal health and welfare, the prevention and relief of animal suffering, and the promotion of public health. Climate change clearly poses a threat to animal health and welfare, as well as to public health, and it causes animal suffering. So as a veterinarian, I feel duty-bound to act on climate change, and that's why I'm here tonight.
Thank you, Angela. Over to you, Teresa.
Hey, before we start, I'd just like to acknowledge the Biripi people as the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting. I'd like to acknowledge elders, traditional owners and ancestors, both past, present and those emerging. And I'd like to extend my respect to all other Aboriginal people here today. So my name's Teresa and I'm a proud Dunghutti woman. Currently have lived on Biripi country for most of my life. So I'm very passionate about the animals and the biodiversity that lives here. This love for the environment and being so connected to Indigenous culture has resulted in me doing a Bachelor of Environmental Science and Management. I'm currently in my final year doing an honours research project on eucalyptus and how koalas choose to select these and what the chemistry means going forward. So working in environmental science and like what I'm studying, I'm constantly looking at resources and journal articles about the impacts of climate change and what that means for my industry going forward, but also what that means for community and biodiversity and animals, especially studying the importance of the koala, you know, gula, a Biripi word, you know, with the bushfires happening and removing so much prime habitat for, you know, diet selection and just the loss of such a beautiful and iconic animal to our area. I just feel like that's why I'm here tonight. I have to speak for, you know, the animals, I have to speak for culture, but I also have to speak for community and for young people because climate change is affecting our generation. It's affecting all of us now, and it's going to get worse. And being a part of discussions like this and sharing stories with community allows us to have a better understanding, but also opens our minds to different perspectives and different understandings. So thank you all so much for coming and listening to us. And thank you. I look forward to it.
Thank you, Teresa. And last but not least, Gordon.
Thank you, Jane. Gordon Birch. So I'm here really with a science background, but I was at the coalface a long while ago, probably 40 years ago now. But my research was in fact into land degradation and some of the very early problems that we faced back in the 70s and 80s with excessive clearing, wood chipping and such like. and I played a bit of a role in getting the government to do something more formative about that. And fortunately, in those days, it was the Hawke government, the Hawke ministry were very responsive to that. So there does need to be an interconnect between our concerns and research and science into the environment and political leadership. And I know that's a very difficult topic, but nevertheless, it's one that we can't step away from. So having asked the question, why have a climate change policy, or why get rid of it? I want to talk a little bit about Dr. Saul Griffith. Now, some of you may know him well. He has written a book called The Big Switch. He's an Australian scientist, engineer, inventor, entrepreneur, and has been an advisor to President Biden on climate change policies in the US. There's a very good podcast which is under the Big Ideas, ABC, and if you can access that, I'd really encourage you to listen to it. His words, "We have no time for miracles and no time to waste. This is now an urgent problem." 20 or 30 years ago, we started doing some of the early research on this, and many of you will remember the sincere effort that Al Gore put into trying to get more global awareness, particularly with his film, An Inconvenient Truth. Despite all that, here we are, and we are not yet galvanised to do something about it. Really, the world is 1 minute to midnight, and there is much to be done. Every person, every community, every state, every nation must take action to reduce or cease the use of fossil fuels. There's no question about that. The problem is bringing it about, and bringing it about through the political will of nations all around the world. The time we have is so short that we actually can't operate under normal economic rules. So those that might say, we'll be fine, we'll put in a carbon tax or carbon credits or such like, I'm sorry, it's too late. We now have to operate right outside the current rules that are used for economics when it comes to running countries. Much too late to use a carbon tax, and much too late to employ more pseudo-carbon credits, which has been one of the government initiatives. And I want you all to just, for a moment, remember Malakuta. Remember Cobargo. There will be nowhere to run and nowhere to hide when the worst of the climate catastrophes start to hit. There is no doubt about it. And we need to impress on our community that unless action is taken, and we're part of it, that's the sort of foreseeable future that we're leaving for our grandchildren and the next generations. Tonight, there is already so much committed carbon. The concept of committed carbon is that even if we today made a decision to stop all mining and use of fossil fuels, there is so much carbon in the systems of transport, et cetera, that it's going to take a very long time for that committed carbon to work its way through the various economies of the world. And that committed carbon means that the world will be 2 degrees hotter before we can start to really make any impact through reductions of carbon dioxide. Now, we all try to be optimistic, but that is the reality. And it's probably, unless we see more action, it's probably going to be worse than that. We need near 100% adoption rates, that's what I mean by electrification, to replace energy use that generates the majority of CO2. And we need to start now. Our tools will be EVs, solar panels, wind turbines, heat pumps and batteries. We have all these now. We don't have to wait. Hydrogen can help, but it's 3 times more costly than solar as a usable fuel in the future. Its use is potentially in things like steelmaking or aluminium smelting. And with our solar capacity in this country, Australia should become one of the steel manufacturing hubs of the world, or aluminium smelting hubs of the world. We could do it entirely through solar and the hydrogen that can be generated through solar. So where do we use energy in Australia? 43% is by households. That's including our cars. 25% in businesses, 25% in transport. Now, if we electrify everything in households, each household could save up to $5,000 per year. The economic incentive is enormous, but still, we do nothing. Direct action on each of these aspects of the use of energy is really best achieved locally. That's us. So, every LGA in Australia needs a climate action plan or policy. If we want to avoid the catastrophic consequences of extreme global warming, and we can start to do this now. Why is it not happening? In Saul Griffith's words, because we need a better narrative and better leadership. We need to work as a team. It's that simple. The benefits are immediate. Every family in our LGA and any other LGA can save thousands each year if we start to do something. And if we electrify everything, and the world will, if we electrify everything today, the world will use half the energy we use today. And that's an enormous change. But we don't have much time to wait.
Thank you, Gordon. As you can all see, we've got a wide range of expertise, passion for the subject, and commitment to find solutions. So I thank you for that. We're now going to move on to the frequently asked questions by the community. And the first question is, and this is for Angela, for Georgia and Teresa. Are there specific risks or costs of not having a climate policy? So we'll go to Angela first, if that's okay.
Thank you. I thought I would focus on the legal risks associated with not having a climate policy, and had a look at the website of the international law firm Minter Ellison. Minter Ellison has a soft spot in my heart because they did a lot of pro bono work for Energy Forever. But I had a look at their website. Now, this is a big international law firm, and they've written on their website about climate change risks for local governments. And so I thought, oh, this is something that we should probably hear about in this panel. So I'm paraphrasing from their website now. And it says, local governments need to strategically plan for damage to their own assets and built infrastructure and damage to private assets. Local governments may also need to manage increased exposure to litigation where climate change risks haven't been considered. Now remember, this is a law firm. Claims might be related to matters like development approvals and conditions that don't appropriately consider climate-related issues, and failure to implement strategies for the protection of properties and assets. There have also already been appeals in other states on the basis of other councils' failure to adequately consider climate change in planning-related decisions. Minter Ellison also says that local governments need to actively consider the impacts of climate change on all aspects of its business, including governance frameworks, strategic community plan, and corporate business plan, review of current and proposed infrastructure and assets investments, and review of emergency response plans. Local governments should also consider how climate change may impact its budgets, including possible increased expenditures on health, community care and emergency response capabilities, adaptation and resilience works on public infrastructure and facilities to maintain service levels and protect assets, such as from coastal erosion. And also stormwater and sewerage with more extreme downpours that we've certainly been seeing. And council should also consider how climate change may impact on its revenues. This is something that I hadn't considered before then, including declining or variable rates revenue, potentially arising from declining property values, and adverse impacts on local industries, particularly if there's a concentration of one or a few industries facing physical or economic risks, such as agriculture or tourism. So I think those are quite a lot of significant risks that arise from not having a climate plan.
Thanks, Angela. And over to Georgia.
So I guess in regards to our council, if we're going to do our thing that's right by the earth, we need to try to get to net zero, and that's because we're all allocated a carbon budget, and we have to, that's the first reason why we need a policy. I guess similar to what Angela's talking about, but more focused, if you look at the IPCC report, it's really important that we have adequate planning and adaptation and mitigation for climate change. And I guess inadequate planning, what might this look like? If you can imagine, we've just recently had floods, so just looking at a topic of floods. So last year with our large floods that we had, there was some discussion that maybe the early warning systems didn't work adequately. And so there were people stranded that maybe could have got out or got their cars out of different places. And these are often vulnerable people, lower SES people that are living on floodplains. In addition, they can build things like levees to potentially assist reducing flooding. So this is all mitigation strategies. Potentially restoring wetlands as well and rivers that are natural ways that we can mitigate floods, as well as potentially having no build zones or upstream forest management to try to reduce flooding further down in urban areas. Obviously, sewerage system problems. There's been a big issue with Lismore in flooding, but also in Lake Cat-Eye. And then I guess the other thing is planning urban environments. So if we're going to have bigger heat waves, we need to have shade areas. A lot of the local parks do not have areas with shade under it for children. There's big areas of areas with no shade in our urban environments in Port. So this is all things that council are responsible for and should be helping to mitigate for us as we face climate change.
Thank you very much, Georgia. And Teresa, from your perspective, please.
Yeah, so my perspective on significant risks to not having a climate policy. When I think of this question, I think of, environmental science, because that's my training for like the last 4 or 5 years. But I think the risks just impact pretty much every aspect of our society, like be it people, health. Port Macquarie is known as like one of the most beautiful places, and we're so privileged to live here and have the koala as like one of our animals. But I think, there's risks in every aspect of our life. And, with the increase in like natural disasters, the flow-on effects that has to communities, that also has to biodiversity who, we have to start looking after now, because we're getting to this point where, if we don't do something, like we're just going to lose our native animal. Like the koala is expected to be functionally extinct in the next 50 years in our local government area. And if we're not out there making these actions now, that's going to be true. Like that's predicted. And, the koala is so significant to who we are as a community that having that thing gone would just be heartbreaking. And, living a life where biodiversity is just on the massive rates of extinction. Like we are in a mass extinction event, and Australia is one of the leading places in the world for loss of biodiversity. And that breaks my heart. And I think these risks are something that people need to start looking into, start researching, start understanding what our actions are and how we can change that to, to have this animal that is not going to be functionally extinct, that we can walk through the park and look up in a tree and see a koala. We can go and like have a beautiful summer's day that's not temperatures that are so hot that you just don't want to leave the house. Like So I just think there's so many risks and they impact so many different parts of our life, whether we acknowledge them or not, or whether it's minor or major. And I think, yeah, we really need to start looking at what we're doing and move forward with climate policy.
Thanks for sharing your passion, Teresa. I think it's supported by everyone here. Yeah. So the next question, rather conversely, is to Gordon, Brian and Peter. Are there specific opportunities or benefits of having a climate policy? And we'll go to Gordon first. Thank you.
Thanks, Jane. I think there are enormous benefits. There are many communities around Australia that where private industry has actually already moved in, where there was a satisfactory support for a good climate policy and electrification. I think it's probably not widely known, but if you go to Uralla up on the New England tablelands, there is more than 1,000 hectares of solar panels now in that LGA. It's on the grid into Queensland. It's actually generating 4 times the amount of power that's currently coming out of the coal-fired power stations in the Hunter Valley. So there is enormous opportunities for those LGAs that do set their sights on being a place where renewable energy and positive actions on climate change can take place. And I think we are in grave danger of slipping from that. And whereas we could be a model place, we have a very this is the most uniform climate of any location in Australia. People probably don't realise that, but it is. And so there are enormous opportunities here for us to demonstrate what would be a model community adopting very ambitious targets for climate change. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you very much. And Brian?
The benefits of having a climate policy. Well, the climate policy is really the foundational policy for all of the council's decisions into the future. It's interesting when you go through the climate policy, this is the document that it's proposed to be revoked. What does it say? Well, in a nutshell, in its simplest form, it's a statement of principles. And it declares that council will adopt the following principles in response to climate change. First one is the precautionary principle. Now, there's no benefit in explaining what that means. We go through our lives on the precautionary principle. We don't let our children run out on the road. We wear seatbelts. We do all these things. The precautionary principle is the basis of how we lead our lives. And it says, council will apply the precautionary principle to climate change adaptation in order to mitigate threats of serious or permanent harm to the environment or our community. Council will avoid using uncertainty as a justification for not addressing risks adequately or in a timely manner. This is the person that says, prove it to me. Prove that the earth is warming up. Well, you don't have to go out to prove it to him, but you say to him, well, you better worry about it if it does. That's the precautionary principle. And then under this principle, the council will develop and implement short and long-term actions that seek to achieve resilience, and resilience is a key word here, and a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, whilst also delivering other social, economic and environmental benefits. That's the first principle. The second principle is the collaborative and capacity building approach. Council will build the adaptive capacity and the resilience of council and its communities through active engagement, transparent, proactive communication and education regarding emissions and reduction measures and the identification and management of climate-related risks. And then the principle of risk mitigation and management. Council will take account of all available evidence to understand and prepare for climate change-related risk to council, its business, and the community. We will ensure that climate change factors are integrated into our risk assessment framework. Now, it's a statement of principles, absolutely foundational onto how council should conduct its business. What's there not to like about that?
Thank you very much, Brian. And Peter, would you like to just comment on the same question, please?
Sure. Port Macquarie Hastings Council is also a participant in the Cities Power Partnership with 165 other councils around Australia. Not having a policy which is similar to those other councils, which joins them in that partnership, I would have thought puts them at great risk of sharing in a huge amount of creativity and ideas around the whole nation. And when you think about the things that Gordon said and alluded to, what are some of the the real practical opportunities? There is, I have no doubt, within councils there is a huge number of staff and there's a huge number of people in the community who can have such a creative input into what this community and other communities around Australia look like. But you do need the policies in order to give those staff and those people who are creative confidence that their voice goes somewhere. And that I think is the great opportunity. If I close my eyes, because I see things better sometimes when I close my eyes, I think of a place where I don't breathe carbon monoxide fumes anymore. And I can't see how that's a bad thing. And to be more, to bring myself back to the real world right now, when I look at, for example, along the river at Brisbane and I see a marvellous pathway where the transport is all EVs and e-scooters and people on bikes and roller skates, thousands of them travelling to work each day on a beautiful corridor that doesn't mean you have to build bigger roads, I just think is a much better vision than just doing what we do. And just finally, just so that taking up on Gordon's point, that a lot of this stuff is not new. When we built our tree houses down at Diamond Waters, we put in refrigerators that have external compressors. They use between 16 and 32 watts compared to 300 watts of your other similar size refrigerators. We did that in 2010. I don't understand why external compressors aren't everywhere.
Thanks, Peter. That's great to hear. So, coming to you, Leslie, what do you think about the step Council has taken to date?
I have to be careful about how blunt I can be.
You don't need to be careful.
I think, no, definitely no politics from me. Look, I think everyone is just absolutely bewildered about it. And in some ways, you kind of wish that you could understand the reasoning behind why they would rescind it, because then at least as a community, and particularly people in this room that are so interested, would be able to think about some strategies about how we might actually tackle that. But the problem is we have no reasoning behind it. And I think that is actually in itself a serious problem. But just to, I guess, make the point, I find it really ironic that tonight, where our councillors are sitting in a meeting, one of the agenda items actually on the extraordinary council meeting tonight is the Community Strategic Plan. And some of you may have participated in the consultation. I think it was called Think 2050. Enormous amount of work went into it. Lots of consultation, and I commend the staff of council that put in such an incredible effort into that. But I want to read you one line, just one line from the conclusion, which is this policy, remember, is being discussed at council tonight. It says the community, this is results of the consultation that I said you were involved in, says the community is passionate about being sustainable and self-sufficient. They would like to see council take action to help address climate change to mitigate the impact of natural disasters in our region, unquote. That's from council's document. They're discussing tonight to decide whether or not it's going to go into policy. I mean, seriously, they're actually not, as I said before, out of sync, in my belief, with the views of our local community on this issue. They're actually out of sync with their own policy. So I'll just leave my comments at that. I could say so much more.
We're going to change the subject a little now, and I'm going to ask Teresa to comment now on why do you think Port Macquarie Hastings young people are concerned about climate change, and why might that be?
Well, speaking from my own personal experience and, you know, from the people I've talked to through my life, my friends, my roomies, I just think that like a lot of people are scared. Like personally, I don't want to have children because I don't know what the world's going to look like for my kids. Like I'm 25 years old and I'm already thinking like the world in like 25 years could be so intense for me that I don't want to bring a child into a world when it's just continuously going to get worse. And this is a common thing that me and my friends have talked about, like, you know, it's stuff like that. Like we shouldn't be afraid to have children because of the future they're going to have. And like, I don't know, like it's, you know, studying environmental science and being a part of like an environmental science cohort at the uni, like we're constantly having discussions about climate change, about what our future is going to look like, working in industry. Like, is there going to be an industry for us to work in? And what is it going to look like? Like, we're going to go to work and we're going to be so upset about, you know, all these statistics around animals, around society. And I definitely think that Port Macquarie youth and is so passionate about it. Like when you go to see like the school strikes and you go and you see young people younger than myself and just so passionate about the future they're going to have. And I think that energy needs to be out there for everyone, that, you know, like we shouldn't be afraid, but we are. And, you know, that's really disheartening. And I just wish that I was born like 50 years ago so I could go and see the Great Barrier Reef when it was perfect, when it wasn't so impacted. But like, I'm going to go there and I'm going to cry because it's all bleached and it's just getting worse. And there's nothing we can really do about it unless we start doing stuff now.
Yeah. Thank you for your openness. I'm now going to ask some of the panellists to think about their subject matter areas, particularly their expertise and knowledge, and turn to Georgia first and then Angela. What climate change impacts do you anticipate will affect our local community?
Well, I guess talking to climate change with humans at large, not just our local community, we all need shelter, we need food, we need clean air, we need water, and we need really relative climate stability. And if we don't have this, then we're all going to be impacted. So there's really 7 domains that my literature, so from big health journals, talk to about what the future is going to look like and how that's going to impact our health. So I'm just going to address them really briefly here. So the first is extreme weather events. I've moved to Port Macquarie 4 years ago, and I think we've had droughts, wildfires, floods, and also a pandemic. This really impacts mental health. I think we all can appreciate that. So it's a big health issue that's going to come into the future. Heat stress, so heat, dehydration, increased risk of gastroenteritis, but heat stroke is fatal in about 80% of cases, can also exacerbate underlying health issues. And the most at risk are the elderly, which is our local area is very at risk of, given our majorly, you know, our elderly population, but also the young. So they're the two areas. Air quality, and we all lived through the 2019 bushfires. We understand how awful that is, but it's also bad for our health. So there's good evidence that short-term exposure to smoke from bushfires increases cardiovascular and respiratory death. Long-term data for cancer is not known, but I'm sure it also impacts that. At that time, New South Wales Health Emergency Department had about a 1.5 times increase presentation than usual for respiratory and cardiovascular issues. The AMBOs also were called out more for respiratory issues. Water quality and quantity, that was a big concern then as well. Food supply and safety might not be something people understand, but obviously with increased drought, issues with food supply, but even increased CO2 levels is shown to reduce the quality of the food we eat. So in cereals, there'll be reduced protein as well as reduced vitamins and B12 and micronutrients. The sixth issue is infectious disease and vector distribution. So likely we've already got a new mosquito-borne virus, Japanese encephalitis, that's thought to be due to climate change. But other things such as dengue fever is thought to come further south. Things like malaria are harder to determine whether they're going to come into Australia, but no doubt we're going to have increased and different infectious diseases, increased risk of epidemics and potentially pandemics into the future. And then the final thing that impacts health, obviously, is increased conflict potentially for scarce resources. So 7 huge domains where our health is, because we need to live in this environment, we need all these things, you know, to live and survive healthily. So
Thanks very much. And turning to you, Angela.
Thank you so much. From my subject matter expertise, which is veterinary medicine, there is actually a huge amount of overlap with the things that Georgia just talked about as well, because the less dramatic risks to animal health and well-being overlap with those to public health in a One Health paradigm. The dramatic effects, of course, also overlap. There are those extreme weather events. So over the last decade, we've been seeing the projected results of climate change starting to take shape around us. What we're experiencing so far is right in line with the scientific predictions. In November 2019, the property where I live on Lake Innes was directly impacted by the bushfires. And after that experience, if I wasn't already an advocate for taking action on climate, who would be one now? The loss of Australian animals in that summer alone is heart-wrenching. It's estimated that 3 billion wild vertebrate animals lost their lives or their homes in those fires. That number is so staggering that it sounds like it must be flim-flam, but I have looked at the analysis and it's credible, even conservative. We saw some of this close up here in Port Macquarie, and as Georgia mentioned, our precious koalas are threatened. And then last year, we saw the devastating floods with livestock and horses being washed right down the river and out to sea and being rescued from the surf. And now this year, our neighbors to the north are experiencing the same, even worse. With huge numbers of animals affected like this, it's a little overwhelming to sort of take in those numbers, or it's kind of numbing almost when people say numbers like 3 billion or 500,000. But it's also important to stop for a moment and just consider, what did those animals experience? What fear and what pain did they experience? So the Australian government's National Disaster Risk Reduction Framework talks about these dramatic events in detail. And in our local area, we've already experienced these. And we're definitely also vulnerable to sea level rise and associated coastal erosion. Now, of course, Australia has always had fires and floods, and climate change doesn't cause these. And of course, weather would still happen and we can't control that, but these mega events are not like the floods and fires of the past. They are fueled by climate change. What climate change does is it sets the background conditions in which these weather events form. It increases the heat, the moisture, and the energy in the atmosphere where weather events take form, so that when events occur, they are more likely to be more severe. And if we don't get control of this problem, we can expect to see more and more extreme events. I also want to just briefly mention agriculture here specifically. Now, admittedly, agriculture is a significant greenhouse gas emitter after fossil fuel use, but agriculture is on the front lines of climate impacts. And agriculture is also a potential hero of this story by being one of the most practical sources of CO2 drawdown. So I want to make sure that people know that the agriculture industry and farmers are working hard on this, and they deserve all the support we can give. Agriculture's role in climate change, resilience, and mitigation is a huge topic, but for tonight, just incredibly briefly, I just wanted to mention that using animal husbandry techniques that minimize methane emissions, which is a very active area of research, and farming principles and practices that rehabilitate and enhance the overall ecosystem of the farm, results in greater carbon sequestration in the soil, healthier animals, as well as being more productive and less polluting in other ways.
Thanks for the positivity at the end there. And now turning to you, Gordon, as a scientist, and it's a bit of a long question, this one. It's stated that we are quickly running out of time to act to prevent a catastrophe. That catastrophe is the extinction of humanity and the majority of multicellular life on this planet. This is not science fiction, but a physical reality. Why are we procrastinating?
Thanks, Jane. A very complex question, I must say.
In 2 minutes.
I'll try and keep my ideas as simple as possible. Some of you may be aware of Michael Mann, Professor Michael Mann. He is one of the foremost scientists that has done all the basic work about the trajectory of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. He's also a climate modeler and has worked cooperatively with scientists all around the world, particularly our own scientists here in Australia. He wrote a very interesting book called The Madhouse Effect. Has anyone read it? Anyone in the room? I really would encourage you, please, you can get it on your Kindle, you can get it off the net, but just get it and read it, The Madhouse Effect, because he goes through chapter and verse of what happened in the US, where the knowledge about the climate change was actually understood in detail by the fossil fuel industry. And they understood it 40 years ago, but they set about to spread such disinformation. And there are two brothers, the Koch brothers. They are the two wealthiest men in the world. One of them's dead now, but they invested billions in setting up phony science institutes to spread mismessaging about climate change, and whether it was real. In their terms, it was unreal and it wasn't going to happen. That set America back at least 20 years and probably set the rest of the planet back at least 20 years. Now, I've got to tell you, sadly, at COP26, we, Australia, had a pavilion, had a stall, and it wasn't the climate scientists that manned the stall. It was actually the fossil fuel industry that had a demonstration in that stall. The fossil fuel industry is alive and well and doing the best it possibly can in Australia to stop Australia doing anything effective. I mean, it's sad. Angus Taylor should not be in that job. He has been a tool of Woodside Petroleum and Exxon, and just the other day, at a stroke of a pen, he virtually completely changed the criteria for our carbon credit system. And he handed industry at least about $3 billion in the stroke of a pen. Never went near the parliament. And I don't think, we can understand or comprehend just how dirty the game is that's going on out there. And that's one of the reasons why we're so far behind. But we've got to sort of call those people to account. There was another report done by King on the use of carbon credits for agriculture, the planting of trees and the preservation of forests. That guy was out of the fossil fuel industry, and yet he was put in charge of reporting on the efficacy of our investments in forestry and retention of forest. It's garbage, absolute garbage. Now, the other reason I think that why we're not making much progress is, I think a lot of people, maybe most people, are a bit overwhelmed by the complexity of what is said about climate change in the media and in other forums. For the average person, they're not, they're probably listening to the commercial station in the morning, they're flicking on to Channel 7, Channel 9. They're probably reading newspapers that don't necessarily take a very balanced view. And so they are confused, they're overwhelmed. And people look for a glimmer of hope. And they see lots of other things coming in on the internet. They see the conspiracy theorists and they think, well, maybe it's not that bad. You know, maybe there's a thread of truth in what Clive Palmer says, or Craig Kelly, or George Christensen. I could go on. They all use very catchy imagery that it ain't that bad. And so our task is a difficult one. We really have to now deal with this problem, and we need to deal with it quickly. There are more people speaking out, and they need to get in the media. At least Twiggy Forrest is out there being in the media and at least putting forward the way he wants to see a solution provided. So what I'm saying is it's no wonder that we haven't made more progress, because there have been a lot of forces against a rational response by any society, whether it's ours, but particularly America. Europe's probably a little better, but it is a massive problem. And unfortunately, our government is right in the midst of that massive problem. The real glimmer of hope is that when you look at the New South Wales government, you've got people like Matt Keane, who's absolutely aware of what needs to be done and is very clear about his messaging. And he's right in there. You know, he's right in there in our Conservative Liberal government. And so it can be done. Even Pat Connaughton on radio this morning, you know, came out and said, that's not my views. I believe in net zero by 2050. The sad thing is we actually need to do better than net zero by 2050.
Yeah.
So, you know, I can understand it, but social media somehow or other, you know, we've got to get those that are capable with it, and the young people, to be there in social media and spreading what is truth and really undermining those that are out there just peddling lies, really.
Thank you for those positive comments towards the end there, Gordon. I think that's helpful. Now, yay. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining us. Okay, that's great to hear. We've got other councillors on the way, and Nick's already here, so wonderful. In the interest of time, I think we're going to stop applause between questions because we've got lots of questions to move through, and I'm now going to move on to question 9, Georgia, which is, there's a popular phrase, think global, act local. What can Port Macquarie locals do to act locally and address climate change? And do you have some ideas and some examples you can give us?
Yeah, sure. So I'll try to be brief. So this is the positive stuff about climate change and how you as an individual can do stuff. So the first area is food. So obviously buying from local producers, trying to research. There are some amazing local farmers that are really passionate about regenerative farming. So you can buy their meat, your meat from them, or, you know, buy your organic milk from them. Try to have more of a plant-based diet. Sounds hard, but that is definitely an important area because you know, meat and other aspects of contribute about 25%, I think, to CO2. Also buy Australian made at the shops. As far as energy, obviously we've discussed solar does reduce your costs. It's very expensive to put it in, but once you've got it, your energy bills significantly decrease. We noted that. Otherwise, you can go to green electricity providers. There are some that just use renewable energy. As far as waste, I think that's something that's great that is in the country that we didn't have in the city. So green bins, it really significantly reduces your waste. So make sure you're using that. You can do RED recycling at soft plastics recycling at your local Coles or Woolworths, where you recycle any Glad wrap or any plastic that comes in the shopping centres that you can't use, as well as reusing plastic. Things like ticking the carbon offset when you're going on a flight. Only 1 in 10 people do that. They actually plant trees and try to offset your flight by doing that. Installing rainwater tanks, and then obviously with your money, so superannuation, trying to invest in ethical environmental superannuation, and trying not to buy new things constantly. So secondhand shopping, they're sort of positive individual things you can do as a local level, I guess.
Thank you. That justifies my next trip to the op shop. Thank you. Okay, so now moving on to our local economy, and I'm going to turn to Leslie and Peter. Will addressing climate change negatively impact our economy and perhaps cause unemployment? Leslie?
Well, actually, on the contrary, I think actually not doing anything, not addressing it is going to have a considerable impact on our local economy. And Gordon touched on a couple of those before when he talked about manufacturing and the uptake of renewable energy, and, actually producing those locally. And I mean, actually in Australia. And, we as a community really want to see that leadership, I think, from a local level. And in fact, that's what businesses are looking for when they're thinking about coming to invest in our local community. If you look at the top 100 companies in Australia, what they are now talking about, and what are they, if they're not already developing their policies, they are in the process of doing it, and that is about resilience to climate change. And so if they're looking at, expanding their business, starting new parts of their business, say in a regional community like the Port Macquarie Hastings, and they will do their research because, they have shareholders that they're responsible for. And they do their research and they find that actually the local council here doesn't have a climate change response policy, isn't thinking about that resilience and how we manage into the future, how we become more resilient. They're going to think twice about coming to invest here. I mean, it just is logical that they would. These are business people. They need to make money for their shareholders. And so I think actually by not having that guidance there through a climate change response policy is actually going to have a significant impact into the future. So I really hope that councillors will think about that when they go to debate this rescission, because it is a really, really important aspect and one of the real negatives of not having a policy on the ground.
Thank you very much, Leslie. And welcome to Councillor Shepherd that's sitting at the back now. And yes, thank you. So Peter, would you like to comment on the economy?
Very briefly, I think Leslie covered it really well. But in thinking about this question, I reflected the same issues and concerns actually occurred with the emergence of the electricity industry. The same things occurred with the emergence of IT and the fear of change with that. I'm sure that there's an element of fear about changing from a carbon to a different form of energy and future, but we always have a way around that. I don't think we need to be afraid of that. I think we just need to listen to what Leslie just said.
Thank you very much. It's about adaptation, isn't it? And I think Australians are very good at that. So finally, before we move on to the specific topics that are from our community, I'd like to ask Teresa a question, which is some talk about climate change having a worse impact on vulnerable populations compared to others. Would you like to give us your opinion on why that might be?
So when I read this question and I was thinking about it, my mind kind of went in two ways. So when I think of vulnerable communities, I think of environment. So I think of biodiversity that are really impacted by the impacts of, climate change and what that means for our animals and our fauna and our flora. But I also, when thinking of this question, I thought about myself and my standpoint of being an Indigenous woman. And I think Indigenous people, especially we're talking about on Biripi country, I think the impacts of climate change are having some significant impacts on mental health and spirituality and connection to country. And so part of who I am is that when I go bushwalking, you know, I'm always looking for animals. I'm always trying to feel the environment. I'm trying to get involved in it. And I know, talking to like my aunties, my uncles, elders in the community, that they are having this, like, sadly, like their hearts are breaking to see what's happening to their culture, happening to their lands that they've been on for 60,000 plus years. And, you know, like, I think not just Indigenous people, but I think we're all feeling it. I think we're all vulnerable to climate change, and it doesn't matter like who you are, what your life is, there's some aspects are going to impact you. And, you know, I think we're all vulnerable. And if we don't start doing stuff about it, like, who knows, like, you know, people think of the elderly and young and Indigenous and people with disabilities and stuff like that, and youth, but I think we all are vulnerable. And yeah, I just think we need to realize that. And if we don't do anything about it, it's going to impact us more and more in little and big ways.
Thank you very much. So we're now going to move on to some quick fire questions. These are questions that have been generated by some of you in the audience will probably recognise your questions, but also from our community. Panel, you have 1 minute each to answer these topics. So I'm going to start off with Leslie. By revoking climate policy, does this mean council will be unable to attract grants into the future? And do you think other councils will follow suit?
I'd be very surprised if other councils follow suit in terms of rescinding their climate response policy. And we heard previously that councils north and south of us are actually putting them into place. I guess in answering that question, I go back to the term resilience. Now, when the government are investing your money into particularly infrastructure, what we are increasingly doing is looking at infrastructure projects that are going to be resilient to climate change. That would make sense. Why would we invest, say, in a road along a coastal area? And why would we provide that money to council if, in fact, there is no guarantee that that road's going to be there in another 10 or 20 years? So I guess that's the kind of the overarching comment I would make about it. It's no yes, no answer. It depends what kind of grants they are and all that sort of thing. But obviously, because we have a very clear climate change policy in New South Wales, and thank you for acknowledging my dear friend Matt Keane, who now holds the Treasury's role, so that's even better because he controls that money. And of course, we thank him for his investment in our local community with the koala land recently, which was fantastic. But you know, we have a policy that we will reflect our decisions on, let's say that, and we need to invest your money wisely, and we're not going to invest it where there is not a real guarantee of resilience to climate change. I'll leave it at that.
That's great. You've answered 2 questions in one.
Oh,
perfect. So moving over to you, Angela. Climate wouldn't be an issue if the Earth wasn't so overpopulated. Isn't overpopulation the real issue?
Thank you. The short answer is yes, of course. Population is certainly a contributing factor. Simple maths. The more of us there are, if we're all polluting, there's going to be more overall pollution. So that's where the simple part ends. I think population can become somewhat of a scapegoat in the climate change discussion, and it's really important to be careful with this for a couple of reasons. Firstly, we're not all polluting the same amount. Greenhouse gas emissions per person are not uniform, with the upper, middle, and high income groups, 49% of the population contributing 80% of global emissions, and the lowest income 9% of the population contributing just 0.4% of emissions. And of all the solutions we have at hand for responding to climate change, this is one of the most challenging. There are certainly strategies that can help in an ethical and supportive way. And if there's time, Georgia can tell us more about these. But I do think that the idea of trying to control human population can be incredibly problematic ethically as well as practically. I also get concerned because I have heard this discussion border into xenophobia, othering, and even dehumanizing language. And we definitely need to be alert to and avoid this risk. Finally, I find that when we focus on population, overly, it can detract attention from some of the really practical, achievable opportunities that we have to reach the emissions reductions we need using already existing technology. So while not pretending that population isn't a problem, it's definitely not the problem. That's too simple to say. And the challenges that are associated with population shouldn't prevent us from taking all the actions that are available to us today.
Thank you. And we definitely have time, Georgia, for you to follow up. Thank you.
There was just two things to add. So, you know, the solutions to population growth is well known, educating women and empowering women. So educated women choose to have less children. And also, you know, equitable access to contraception. I mean, a lot of the population don't even have access to appropriate contraception. So if we started with those simple things, potentially that would help to solve that problem.
Thank you. Gordon, we are going to turn to a more global issue now. And this is from the community. If India and China aren't doing their part, what point is there in doing anything locally?
Well, it's a very simple answer, and that is that, in fact, right now, Australia per capita, we're generating 4 to 10 times the emissions per capita than is currently being generated by either the Chinese or the Indians. So per capita, we don't look good. The other part of it is that India, of course, is in a different trajectory to that of China. But China already technologically is probably one of the most advanced, if not the most advanced country with respect to technologies for solar energy and wind energy. You all know that there was a Chinese student that got a PhD out of the University of New South Wales, and he went back and built the solar cell industry in China. I think that's right, isn't it, Stuart? So yes, it is a problem. I mean, China is still building coal-fired power stations, and there's a mismatch all around the world with respect to how quickly we can phase out of coal-fired or any fossil fuel generation of power. But if we don't set at least a strong international example, then we're not going to have any bargaining chip at the table worldwide. And that's going to be the most important thing in the near future. The impacts of climate change are going to accelerate. The impacts of change in our economy are also going to accelerate. It's going to be a frightening situation. But if we're not ahead of the game, and if we as communities are not taking the sort of steps that state governments or federal governments can point to and say we are acting responsibly, then we're not going to be much of a world player. And that's the real danger.
Thank you, world leadership. So Brian, moving to you now in terms of question 8. How do we propose to better manage greenfield property development in terms of bushfire and flood-prone areas?
Thank you. I'm not sure what the questioner means by greenfield property development, but let me just bring it back to how do we propose to better manage property development in terms of bushfire and flood-prone areas? Easy. We begin with having a foundational document dealing with our that will deal with our response to climate change. And from that document, Council will then develop specific policies for development in fire areas, fire-prone areas, policies such as the type of housing, the resilience of housing, housing materials, access roads. Will you permit people living up dead-end roads where there's only one way out in the event of a fire? These are the matters that Council will competently deal with in developing its policies as when it bases that policy development on its foundational policy. Likewise with floods. Easy.
Thanks, great answer. Peter, we're on question 9. So this is specifically around issues of risk, sustainability and resilience. How do you think council can operate without some acknowledgement of climate change, and particularly in terms of its own council operations and the protection of public assets into the future?
They can't, and I suspect they don't. You know, they can't ignore it. I mean, you know, you just think about all the processes council does, and Brian just mentioned some around the planning for flood and bushfire and a whole range of different risks. There's very few organisations that I know, and certainly not in health, where climate response doesn't feature as part of the risk management plan. For heaven's sakes, it features in Camden Haven's Food and Wine Festival risk management plan. So, I mean, this is nothing. This is not rocket science. This is nothing new. But the problem with the issue they've got at the moment is the potential for inconsistency and conflict and miscommunication because the overarching policy is not there.
Thank you. Angela, we're moving on to transitioning from fossil fuels to renewables. It's talked about as if it will solve everything, but don't wind turbines cause a huge amount of animal deaths?
Thank you. This is an important question because obviously as conservationists, we certainly don't want to do harm. So yeah, this is a consideration and it's worth talking about, but fortunately there has been a lot of progress made on it. So in the 1980s, one of the earliest wind farms in the US, and eventually became one of the biggest at its time, was built in the Altamont Mountain Pass in California, which happens to be a migratory corridor for golden eagles, California condors, and other birds. And that resulted in 75 golden eagle deaths per year due to the farm's turbines, obviously a terrible outcome. When those turbines were replaced by more modern ones, which are taller and turn more slowly, mortality was reduced. And obviously the key mistake in that wind farm was the location. Moving forward from that, a 2020 study in Norway found that the beautifully simple intervention of painting 1 of every 3 blades black reduced bird mortality by 70%. Amazing. And for the bat fans, a 2020 study in Texas found that acoustic deterrence reduced bat mortality a similar amount. Now, lastly, while I don't want to see any animals killed, I think it is important for perspective to compare bird mortality from various sources. So just a few quick statistics for causes of bird mortality in the US in 2009. Deaths due to wind turbines, nearly 20,000, not good. Due to nuclear power facilities, 332,000. Communications towers, 4 million. Pesticide poisoning, 72 million. Windows of buildings, 97 million. And 110 million due to feral cats. Again, in the 2019 bushfires, 3 billion native animals, including birds in Australia. All of this is very, very sad. It does put in perspective the proposition that we should avoid using wind power, which is one of our strongest tools in the challenge to reduce emissions because of those wildlife losses, especially now that we have better information about location planning and more modern turbine design to reduce those risks.
Thanks, Angela. And we're on to Teresa now. Do you agree that retaining existing native vegetation and tree cover, as much as we possibly can, is an effective way of sequestering carbon? And how can people convince governments that it's in the community's interest for effective legislation and regulation to retain and enhance our native vegetation?
So yeah, I do agree that, you know, retaining existing vegetation that we currently have in community will definitely help be an effective way of, you know, sequestering carbon, because, you know, trees turn carbon into oxygen, what we breathe. We love that. But I think it's a good starting point. I think keeping native vegetation as we have is good, but we definitely need to do more. Like, we need to go out and start planting trees, especially ones that are endemic to our local government area, so that our animals are also getting benefits, not just us as a community. I think how people can like convince governments and get involved is coming to things like this, having discussions with, you know, your friends. Like, when you go to a park, sit down and actually have a look, like, this tree is like helping us, like this, you know, like, it's, as someone said before, like, when you go to a park and there's no trees, it can be so sad. Like, it's a hot summer day, like, nothing's better than a bit of shade. So I don't know, I think there's definitely, so far we can go with native vegetation and planting days. And I think we really, really need to stop with deforestation. And I know that it can be really hard, especially with housing developments and increases in population. And like, even over the last few years, like, seeing housing estates pop up around Port Macquarie, it's like, if we're doing that, we need to biodiversity offset. We need to be planting trees. Like, if we're cutting a tree down, we need to plant 2 trees so that, you know, we are having, you know, better vegetation, but also better health outcomes for us when it comes to the air that we breathe.
Great, thank you. Brian, on a very local matter, were you nervous over the resilience of Port Macquarie canals with the recent floods?
I'm reading from the question here. Did you paraphrase that or shorten it?
Not really.
Okay.
But you answer your question.
Yeah, it said, was I nervous over the resilience of the Port Macquarie canals with the recent floods? Well,
From a development
that sounds
perspective.
like one of those gotcha questions. Like, what's the price of a litre of milk? Or what's the current cash rate? That's a gotcha question.
Brian, the question is in the audience.
But let me say that I have been, I've spent my lifetime working on the Settlement Shores Canal Estate, waterways development. And I have often said that if the big one comes down the Hastings, the safest place to be is going to be on those 2 bridges in Park Street, because they are the only structures in our local government area that have been fully engineered to resist the largest possible flood. And the largest possible flood will be something like that happened at Lismore, to a lesser degree, the extraordinary flood we had at Telegraph Point. Now, the historic flood levels at Lismore and at Telegraph Point were empirical levels that were, you know, in European settlement over 200 years. But those sort of floods have probably happened before. And with the tools we have available to us today, with our mathematical models, their computer models, we can simulate huge floods and see how these areas will perform. Now, the Lismore flood, Lismore, as you know, was at the conjunction of about 5 major streams and rivers, the Wilson River, and it's at the foot of the hill. Now, all those rivers come down, and guess where they all meet up and converge? Right in the heart of Lismore. Now, we have the tools these days to model that. What happens if, which was the case at Lismore, the whole catchment was covered by a very slow-moving rain event that just kept going and going and going, and it had been unprecedented in European history that every one of those streams was at peak discharge at the same time. With the tools available to us today, we can model that. Now, bring it down to the local level. Telegraph Point. Telegraph Point, almost similar to Lismore in that it's at the toe of the hill. From Telegraph Point, the rivers flow slowly down across the floodplain. Now, we can model what will happen at Telegraph Point. Maybe the one that the Telegraph Point flood last year wasn't a real big one. You know, maybe we can have a much larger one than that. If you have a climate change response policy, one of your actions, and you'd go to Leslie Williams in the government and you'd say, we need grant funds because we want to model the risks on each of our major streams. And council will develop models so that we know what is likely to happen when that river is at its, the term they use is maximum possible flood. So coming back to Settlement Shores, they're the only structures in this local government area that have been subjected to the computer modelling to simulate maximum possible flood. So I say to you, if it's going to happen, don't go down Horton Street. You'll be in waist deep water. Get out on one of those bridges.
Thanks for giving us the heads up on that one. Yeah. And finally, Gordon, is it too late to make an impact on climate, or do we just need to focus on responding to the change?
It's not too late. We are going to get consequences that we'd rather not get, but at least the world more generally is waking up to the effect that those consequences are now getting highly likely. Interestingly, I think industry is probably ahead of most governments around the world. Even the backing industry are starting to understand that if we don't start to take independent action at the business and industry level, we can't expect governments to necessarily take the steps that are going to be needed. But we do all need to do a lot better, and I guess I'm getting old to be starting to do it, but I feel that we each have to shoulder some of this burden. I mean, the sad thing is Port Macquarie ought to be like Boulder in the US back 40 years ago. We should be looking to be providing the example of how you could live differently, how you could phase out carbon in our economy and redesign our transport systems around a very different transport mode in our community. That was all done in Boulder 40 or 50 years ago. It's not that hard, but you do need a bit of a vision. And if no one else is going to provide the vision, then we may have to.
Yeah. I think we're looking to the community for that vision, aren't we? So we're at the final stages of the evening, and I'd like to invite the panel to make their closing remarks. We're probably going to go for a minute each, if that's okay. And I'll start with you, Leslie.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm just going to pick up on that last point that Gordon made, because I have a huge amount of faith in our community, and I actually think from their actions that they've taken in the past, that if the council does decide to rescind this climate change response policy, we're actually just going to keep going without them. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Stuart's over there in the room, and he can back me up that on the Mid-North Coast, we have one of the highest uptakes of rooftop solar. Why? Well, I can tell you, Stuart will tell you, you don't get 61 cents feed-in tariff anymore. That's long gone. You don't get any incentives from the state government, because you know why? We actually know that you don't need to be incentivised, because you actually just want to do it, because you know it is a practical action that you can take to respond to climate change. Go way back to before I became a member, Westport Park. Do you remember that? They wanted to put that enormous shed on there. What did the community do? We all came together. We stood outside the shopping centres. We collected signatures, and we convinced, thankfully, my government this time, to put in zones, set in legislation that that land would never be developed. And then I go to the koala land, which we recently bought with the Koala Hospital on behalf of the community. The people in this community just got on with it. 21,000 signatures, no problem at all. We debated it in Parliament. That makes me, one, have a huge amount of faith in my community, but also makes me incredibly proud. And quite frankly, I just think that we will leave council behind. I do want to just close, going back to that word resilience, and I want to acknowledge our 2 councillors that have made it to the room. Oh, 3, who else is here? Oh, Lauren, thank you. Lauren, sorry, I didn't see you sneak in. And I guess my plea to you is just be resilient. We're there with you. We know you've got a tough ride ahead, but you can, I think, because as I reiterate, this community has already demonstrated what we want. We want leadership. We want guidance so that we can continue to take the actions that have been talked about so that we can respond to climate change. So well done to the three of you, and as I said, stay resilient.
Thanks, Leslie. Closing remarks, Brian?
I'm a believer, and I'm imploring the council not to take away from us our climate change response policy.
And I think we're moving on to Georgia.
Sorry.
Juggling the mics.
Look, I'm really grateful all of you came tonight, and I hope we've got plenty of people watching. I think rescinding a climate change policy does not make any sense in today's world. We've got to start working together as a community, and we can do it. And when we start to do it, we'll note that our health benefits will be large. So please go and tell everyone to watch this and do as much reading as they can on the topic. Thank you.
And Peter.
Some people might ask, why have a climate change policy anyway? Well, I think the fact that it's in danger of being rescinded, and we've had this evening here tonight, I think would give great heart to the people who actually put blood, sweat and tears into writing it, and probably a bit of heart. And I think that shows why we need the policies.
Angela.
Thank you. We've talked a lot tonight about adaptation and resilience, and that's incredibly important and necessary. Personally, I'm not ready yet to let go of mitigation, mainly because adaptation is mostly for humans, and in particular, large natural ecosystems such as kelp forests, coral reefs, and rainforests realistically can't be practically helped by adaptation measures. So I continue to emphasize mitigation on behalf of the natural world, even though I know that adaptation measures are absolutely necessary, even with the amount of climate change that we're looking at now. There are two other good reasons not to give up on mitigation. The first is that mitigation is less costly than adaptation or than the cost of extreme weather events. And the other is that there is a point where climate change, if uncontrolled, will become unmanageable with any adaptation measures at all. So even with fantastic resilience plans, we can't decide to blow our emissions budget, but we can definitely meet this challenge. The solutions are at hand. We only need to decide to implement them. This is not to say that it won't take resolution, care, and attention to justice, but it is to say it's not a hardware problem. There are many opportunities for responses and solutions to climate change that use already existing technology and have co-benefits for health, society, and the economy. The science in the latest IPCC report tells us that because we've let things get away, we need to use every tool in the toolbox now to keep things the way we want them. That means all of us, individuals, businesses, finance, industry, agriculture, and government at federal, state, and local levels, all working together and doing the very best we possibly can to genuinely reduce emissions. People ask me for simple things they can do about climate change. I tell them, use your choice, your vote, and your voice. Your choice means we all know how to reduce our personal impacts. Keep doing it. Financial choices, whether you're getting your groceries or your superannuation, every purchase you make can be a force for good. Take a moment and do the research. Your vote, that sounds a little obvious, but what I mean by that is yes, vote accordingly, but also to work with our elected representatives to help them form best policy and communicate with them. And that's what we're talking about doing here tonight. So I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to have this event. And use your voice, normalize this, talk about it, exactly what we're doing now. So again, thank you all so much for tonight.
Thanks, Angela. And Teresa?
Yeah, I'd just like to start by thanking you guys for all coming and listening to us share our truth and share our stories with you all. When I got told about this, it was a little bit daunting to get up in front of the community to share my perspective along with the others, but it's just been such a good feeling to know that community is looking out for now and just future generations, and it's just so empowering and it fills me with so much happiness. But yeah, I just think have conversations with your friends about it. You know, we need to stop thinking and being so ego in who we are. We need to start thinking of the bigger picture of community and what that looks like and who we want to be, not who we are now. So yeah, have conversations, come to things like this. You know, we all have a voice and we really need to use it to promote positivity. And climate change, when you hear the word, it can be really, really scary, but it doesn't have to be. It can be something that's can be so positive, and we as a Port Macquarie community can be the pillars of change, can be communities that people look forward to, and like they're doing something different, but they're doing the right thing. So let's be on the right side of history when it comes to this sort of stuff.
Thank you. And last but not least, Gordon.
Now, I'd like everyone to give Scott Morrison some advice. At the last election, Scott Morrison told Bill Shorten that the Labor Party was going to take away the good weekend for all the tradies in their utes. They couldn't tow their boats under a Labor Party policy. Well, the story I want to tell you is that in the US, the most popular car is the Ford F-150 ute. 50 million are sold annually. And as of today, they're now making an electrified F-150. It'll only cost you $40,000 US, and you can park it in your garage and plug your house in, and it's a backup battery for your power supply. So we can do it, and that's what I want to leave you with. We can do it, but we do need to all have a bit of vision, and what's more, we need a bit of vision coming from our leaders.
Amazing, great story, Gordon. Thank you. Personally, I'm in awe of the expertise, the passion and the commitment that we have locally here. It's demonstrated in our panel of members, and I certainly thank them for giving up their time this evening and sharing their wisdom with us. You've heard the panel put forward reasonable, coherent and fact-based opportunities for action. And you've heard that other councils are generally supporting climate policy and the benefits that go with that governance. As I said at the start, the organisers aimed for this event to provide our residents, our local people, an opportunity to leave tonight feeling more willing and able to discuss climate concerns, solutions, and ensure that those discussions are respectful and positive with one another. I hope you agree that this aim has definitely been achieved. And before I hand back to Ross, the next steps for me personally, and as a reminder to you, and particularly those on the live stream, that you can have your say, and all you have to do is go onto the Port Macquarie Hastings Council website before the 6th of May. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, panellists. I was allowed 2 ad lib. One was the bit where I think where I joked about doing the sound test from the UK, and then I have Ross's summary to be taken from panel answers. How do you summarise 2 hours of, I don't know, I haven't had so much information since I left uni, I don't think, and I can tell you what, I never took this many notes, and I've got a friend here that I sat next to in lecture halls, and I can tell you now I definitely didn't take those notes. Before I get into a summary, there was a $10 charge for everyone that come tonight. When we had 25 people, we covered the hire of the room, so thank you. I think I actually thought I had the lotto numbers because I went 42 on one side, 26, there was 7 on the stage, Jane and I were 2, then there was 77, 78, 79, so there's the Powerball numbers if you get into it tonight. But we definitely covered the $25, the $250. All the other proceeds will go to Energy Forever. I don't have a great deal of information about that. So if you Google Energy Forever and don't write forever like I have, like I love someone forever, you'll find the information. Something that come about from all the panellists was a passion, and a passion for the environment, a passion for our local community, a passion for our country. The other thing that has stemmed through, and I discussed at the beginning, was leadership. Now, the 3 councillors at the back in the room are showing the leadership. We've got... And while I think we all agree that climate change should be apolitical, I think somebody said we still need to interconnect with our politicians. We have until the 6th of May to use the Have Your Say portion of the council website to try and influence the other councillors. Because there's no good trying to influence the 4 that have assisted in putting this event on. There has to be one of those people that is a good leader and will listen to the people that they are leading. Good leaders listen and good followers follow good leaders. And that's why we're very fortunate to have 3 of them back in the room. Beyond the leadership, I think, there's some amazing things and stats, and we hear them and we probably get washed over, but 3 billion native animals. We all lived through the Black Summer bushfires. I live just on the other side of the hill here. The smoke from the peat fire was just horrendous. And we've all lived through that. We don't want to experience that again. But if we go over the hill to Uralla, here's a small community that's making a difference with solar panels. I grew up in a small country town. Uralla's not a backwater, but I'm sure there'd be plenty of people that would go, where is Uralla? So I think there's a community that's taking the lead, and that's an opportunity for us to take the lead. There's risk. I manage a very high risk business. I'll always like to think the benefits of an opportunity far outweigh the risk, and there is opportunities. And I think we need to look at those. We need to work through those things, but there's an opportunity for everyone here in this room. There's some really big things that come. Our young people are scared, and rightly so. We find it overwhelming. It's very difficult to find a truth, but we need to spread the truth. There was one comment that came out, and it was that you have to avoid hiding behind uncertainty. So we need to come out from behind that rock and spread the truth. I made an observation a number of years ago that never have we had the capability to communicate so well, yet we do it so poorly. So thank you very much for coming here tonight and listening. We have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. But we need to use our mouth now to let other people know what we've heard. We need to use that communication tools available to us. I'm pretty sure everyone here is on Facebook. If you're not, you'll be on something, or you know someone that is. Don't spread rumour and innuendo. Use any of those platforms to spread truth, but have conversations like this with your friends, with your loved ones, with people that you work with. One of the things I think important for the council, and back to why we're here, is we have an opportunity to provide an example. The council is already a member of 160 other councils across Australia that are participating. So I missed the group, sorry, I couldn't get it down. But we have the capability to provide an example. And thank you, Leslie, for saying those leadership words, because this community does stand up and fight when it wants to. And this is really important. So we've got to the 6th of May to have that say. If they don't listen, then we can't shut up. We'll just have to be louder. So thank you very much. 8:02, Jane, I've gone 2 minutes over, so thank you very much to all the panellists. We really appreciate you giving up your time. I've found it a wonderful 2 hours. I hope that everyone here has, and you all take something away and we can make a change together. Thank you.